The listing was short. One paragraph, posted on the internal board at the ranger station on a Wednesday morning, describing the position in the kind of plain administrative language that made it sound like any other job. Overnight watchtower attendant, northern section. Monitor for fire activity and unauthorized camping. Maintain radio contact with station. 8 hours, 5 nights a week. The pay was listed at the bottom, and it was a reasonable step up from what I was making as a ranger. There was a single note at the end of the listing, separate from the rest of the text, added in by hand in Dave's handwriting. It said that the previous occupant had vacated the position after one night, and that the role was available immediately. I read that part twice, not because it concerned me, but because I was trying to understand what kind of person takes an overnight watchtower position in an isolated section of forest and decides after a single night that it is not for them. I had been a ranger for 3 years by then, and I had done enough overnight work in the field to know that the forest at night was not a frightening place once you knew it well enough. It was just dark and quiet and full of ordinary things, doing ordinary things without any light to do them by. Most people who found it unsettling just did not know it well enough yet. I put my name in for the position that same afternoon. Dave called me into his office the following morning and went through the details. The tower was at the end of a gravel road in the northern section, about 20 minutes from the station. It had been built decades ago and had been maintained in sections over the years. There was a radio setup, a propane stove, a cot, basic equipment. A second tower, Tower B, was positioned further north and slightly east, and there was an active watchman there I could reach on the radio if I needed anything during the night. Dave said the man's name and I wrote it in my notebook, but the ink bled and I could not read it back clearly, and I did not think to ask again. I signed the paperwork and got my keys and drove out to the tower on a Tuesday evening in late September, when the air had just started to carry the first hints of something colder on the way. The tower sat at the end of the gravel road, exactly where Dave had said it would be, and it was taller than I expected when I actually stood at the base of it and looked up. The structure was all wood and steel cable, built in layers over the decades so that you could see the different eras in the materials if you looked closely enough. The stairs went up the outside of the frame in a long switchback, and at the top, there was a square cab with windows on all 4 sides and a narrow balcony that wrapped all the way around it. I took my gear up in 2 trips, a bag with clothes and food and a few books I probably would not read, a second bag with a radio, extra batteries, a good flashlight, a pair of binoculars, and a hunting knife I had carried since my first year as a ranger. The cab at the top was small, but not uncomfortable. There was a cot along one wall, a table with a chair, a small propane stove, and a mounted radio setup that had been there long enough to have a coating of dust on the dials. I wiped it down with a rag from my bag and tested the signal. It came through fine. I got settled in before dark and spent the last hour of daylight walking the balcony and getting my bearings. I could see for a long way in every direction from up there. The forest stretched out below and around me in every direction, broken only by the occasional ridge or the faint silver line of a creek cutting through the trees somewhere to the east. The sky was clear that first night, and by the time the sun finished going down, the stars were out in a way you almost never see if you spend most of your time near any kind of town. The temperature dropped quickly once the light was gone, and I went back inside and made coffee on the propane stove and sat down at the table. My job was straightforward. Watch the tree line for fire, check in on any overnight camping areas that were visible from the tower, monitor the radio for any contact from the ranger station or from the second watchtower, which was positioned further north and slightly east. They called that one Tower B. Use the mounted spotlights if I needed to get a better look at something. Log anything unusual. That was it. 8 hours, mostly sitting, mostly watching, with a walk around the balcony every so often to stay awake. The first few hours passed without much happening. I drank my coffee and listened to the woods and got used to the specific sounds that this part of the forest made at night. Every patch of forest sounds a little different once it gets dark. Different species moving around, different densities of underbrush affecting how sound travels, different drainages creating their own low ambient noise. I had learned to read those sounds over 3 years of ranger work, and I spent the first part of that night just cataloging what I was hearing. Wind moving through the upper canopy, which had a slow, rhythmic quality to it. The occasional snap of something dry and small in the brush below, probably a rodent. An owl a long way off to the west, calling every few minutes in the same pattern. Nothing out of the ordinary. I made a second cup of coffee around 1 in the morning and did a check of the spotlights, sweeping them slowly across the sections of the tree line that were visible from the balcony. The beams cut into the dark and picked up the edge of the trees and the ground below them, and I moved them in slow arcs and watched for anything that did not fit. There was nothing, just the trees and the ground and the darkness between them. I went back inside and sat down and opened one of the books I had brought. It was a history of early fire lookout stations in the region, which I had picked up at a used shop in town a few weeks before. I read for a while, not really tracking the words closely, just letting my eyes move across the page while part of my attention stayed with the windows and the view outside. It was around 2 in the morning when I first heard something. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of sound that would have made anyone stop what they were doing and stand up fast. It was just a sound that was slightly out of place with everything else I'd been hearing. A movement in the brush below the tower, something larger than a rodent, with a rhythm to it that was different from the way deer moved at night. Deer tend to move in short bursts and then stop and listen. This was more continuous, more directional, like something moving with a specific destination in mind. I put the book down and picked up the binoculars and went to the window. I could not see much without the spotlight, so I went out onto the balcony and activated the nearest one and moved it toward the base of the tower where the sound seemed to be coming from. There was a man standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was maybe 30 yards from the base of the tower, standing in the edge of the spotlight's reach, and he had the look of someone who had been walking for a while. His clothes were unremarkable. A jacket, dark pants, boots. He was standing still, looking out into the trees away from the tower, and when the spotlight hit him, he turned and looked up at me without any particular alarm, the way a person looks at a passing car. I went down. It was not the standard protocol, maybe, but it was also not unusual for someone to get disoriented in this part of the forest after dark. Campers wandered further than they meant to all the time. I had my flashlight and my knife, and I had been doing this kind of thing for 3 years. I went down the stairs and walked over to him and told him my name and asked if he was all right. He said he was fine, just turned around. He had been trying to find the main campsite, the one about 2 miles south of the tower, and had somehow ended up going in a circle. He spoke in a regular, level way, a little tired sounding, but nothing that seemed off. He looked like a man who had been hiking longer than he meant to. I told him the direction he needed to go and gave him a rough description of the landmarks to watch for. He thanked me, nodded, and walked off into the trees in the direction I had pointed. I watched him go until the darkness took him. Then I went back up the stairs and went back to work. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. I made a note of the encounter in my log, checked the spotlights again, and settled back into the quiet rhythm of the night. Then I heard it again, the same sound as before, something moving below the tower with that same continuous, directional quality. I picked up the binoculars before I even stood up. I moved to the window and looked down toward the base of the stairs where the spotlight still lit a patch of ground. The man was back. He was standing in roughly the same place he had been before, except this time he was not looking out into the trees. He was looking up, straight up, directly at the window where I was standing. I could not see his face clearly from that distance, not in the way the light was hitting him, and I thought for a moment that maybe he had gotten turned around again and come back to ask for more directions. It happened. People did that. I started to move toward the door to go back down. Then he tilted his head slightly to one side, and the angle of the light shifted just enough, and I stopped moving. There was nothing there. Where his face should have been, there was just skin. Flat, unbroken, without feature. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just the same uninterrupted surface that covered the rest of his head, smooth and pale in the beam of the spotlight. He opened that smooth surface and made a sound that I will not describe in detail, except to say that it was the sound a person would make if they had no mouth to make it from. Muffled, forced, wrong in every way that a human sound could be wrong. I stepped back from the window. I did not move fast. I was not thinking clearly enough to move fast. I just stepped back until my legs hit the cot, and I sat down and held very still and listened to the sound he was making get slowly louder as he started up the stairs. The footsteps on the stairs were slow and even, not hurried, not the sound of something that was angry or frantic, just a steady, unhurried rhythm coming up the switchback, one step at a time, with that muffled sound underneath it the whole way, low and continuous, like something being forced through a surface that was not meant to allow it through. I had the knife out. I do not remember reaching for it. It was just in my hand, and I was sitting on the edge of the cot with my back against the wall beneath the window, listening to him come up. The cab was small. There were 4 windows and 1 door, and no other way in or out. And the door was locked, and I kept telling myself that the door was locked, as if the repetition of it would settle something in my chest that was not settling. The footsteps stopped. I waited. I counted to 60 in my head, slowly, and the only sound was the wind moving through the cables on the outside of the frame and my own breathing, which I was trying to keep quiet. When I got to 60, I counted another 60, and then another after that. Nothing. I stayed where I was for another 10 minutes before I stood up. I went to the window slowly and looked down. The spotlight was still on, and the base of the stairs was empty. I checked the other 3 windows in turn, and there was nothing on the balcony and nothing on the stairs and nothing on the ground that I could see in the range of the lights. I unlocked the door and stepped out onto the balcony and walked the full perimeter of it, looking down at the stairs on all 4 sides, looking at the ground below, looking at the tree line. There was nothing there. I stood there for a long time in the cold air and listened, and the woods sounded the way they had sounded before, the owl still calling somewhere to the west, the wind in the upper canopy, the creek somewhere to the east. I went back inside and locked the door and sat down at the radio and called into the ranger station and gave them my status update. The man on the other end sounded half asleep and told me everything was fine on his end and to check in again at 6. I said I would. I sat there after the call and looked at the window and listened to the rest of the night pass. The sun came up the same way it always did, without any acknowledgement of what had happened a few hours before. I drove home in the morning and slept until the afternoon, and when I woke up, I lay in bed for a while looking at the ceiling. I went over what I had seen through the binoculars. I went over the shape of it, the angle of the light, the distance I had been from the bottom of the stairs. I thought about the way the human brain processes things in low light and stress and sleep deprivation, the way it fills in gaps and makes meaning where there is none, the way tiredness can take something ordinary and tilt it slightly until it looks like something else entirely. I almost convinced myself. I went back that night, and the night after that. Nothing happened on either of those nights. A couple of campers passed through the area visible from the tower on the second night, and I watched them through the binoculars until they made camp and their fire went out around midnight. The woods were quiet. I did my checks and made my logs and drove home in the mornings with the particular heavy peacefulness that comes from a long, quiet night of not much happening. On the 4th night, I made contact with Jim. The radio crackled about an hour into my shift, a little after 1 in the morning, and a voice came through asking for the watchman in Tower A. I told him that was me. He said his name was Jim, and that he was in Tower B, the second tower to the north. He said he had heard I was new to the overnight position and wanted to check in and introduce himself. He had a calm, unhurried way of speaking that I appreciated, the voice of someone who had been doing a quiet job for a long time and was comfortable with it. We talked for a while that first night. He told me about the surrounding area, on the sections of the forest that were driest and most prone to fire risk, the spots where campers most often got lost, the wildlife that moved through in the fall, and which areas to watch more closely as the temperature dropped. He knew this forest the way I was learning it, which is to say from a great height and over a long stretch of time, and he had a specific and useful kind of knowledge about it that I found genuinely helpful. I took notes on a pad I kept next to the radio. We checked in every night after that. Not long calls usually. 20 minutes or so early in the shift, a shorter check near the end of the night, occasionally a brief call in the middle if one of us spotted something worth mentioning. It settled into a routine quickly, and the routine made the nights feel more structured, which helped. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from long night shifts in isolated places. Not a painful loneliness necessarily, but a kind of unmooring, a sense of being slightly outside of the normal flow of time and human contact. Having Jim on the radio at regular intervals helped with that. He never talked much about himself. I know I asked, a few times, the ordinary questions you ask when you are getting to know someone. Whether he had family nearby, how long he had been working the tower position, where he had been before this. He answered in ways that were pleasant, but not particularly specific, long enough to have the shape of an answer without giving much away. I did not push. Some people who do isolated work are that way. They prefer the conversation to stay practical and external, and I respected it. What he was good at was the forest. He could identify almost any sound I described to him and tell me what was likely causing it and whether it was worth investigating. He knew the fire behavior patterns for this specific terrain well enough to explain them in a way I could actually follow and use. He had a sense for the way weather moved through the valleys between the ridges that was more accurate than the forecasts I was getting from the ranger station. On the night of October the 3rd, he told me to keep a close eye on the northeast section of the tree line. He said the wind was going to shift in the early morning hours, and that the section of older growth in that direction had been dry for most of the season. I spent a good portion of that night with the spotlights aimed that way and the binoculars up, watching the edge of the canopy move as the wind did exactly what he said it would. Nothing ignited, but it was a useful reminder that knowing the land mattered, and that he knew it well. On the night of October the 4th, I arrived at the tower just before midnight and got settled and turned on the radio and waited for Jim's check-in. It did not come. At 1 a.m, I tried to reach him on the channel we used. I got static. I tried again at 1:30 and again at 2. I was not immediately concerned. Radios failed. Equipment malfunctioned. There were stretches of certain nights when atmospheric conditions made communication unreliable, and Jim himself had mentioned this happening occasionally, especially in the period just before a weather system moved through. But there were no lights on in Tower B. I had been able to see the faint glow of Tower B from my position on clear nights since I started the job. It was a long way off, barely visible, just a pale smudge of light at the edge of what my binoculars could resolve. I had never thought much about it beyond registering it as there. On the night of October the 4th, it was not there. I kept the binoculars on the area where it should have been and saw nothing, just the dark horizon of the ridgeline and the stars above it. I tried the radio again at 3 and again at 4 and got nothing but static each time. I logged it and kept working. There was nothing else to do. If Jim had a technical problem with his equipment, that was a matter for the ranger station to address in the morning. It was not an emergency. People missed check-ins. Equipment failed. I kept the thought at the front of my mind and stayed with my work and made it through the rest of that night without incident. The following night was October the 5th. I remember the exact date because I wrote it in my log that morning when I got home, before I went to sleep, which was something I did not normally do. I usually made my log notes during the shift and left the rest of it at the tower. But that morning, I wrote the date down on a piece of paper and left it on my kitchen table. And I am not entirely sure why, except that something about the previous night had settled in me in a way that I was not ready to let go of yet. I went back that evening and climbed the tower just before midnight and got everything running and sat down with my coffee and the radio. I did the first hour without incident, and the night was cooler than any so far that season, the kind of cold that comes in off the high ridges and has a clarity to it, a sharp quality that makes everything feel very still and very specific. I did my first balcony check at 1 a.m. and walked the full perimeter slowly, looking down at the tree line in every direction, checking the spotlight positions, listening. There was a woman at the top of the stairs. I had been walking with my attention on the trees below, and I turned back toward the door, and she was just there, standing at the top of the staircase at the edge of the balcony, and the suddenness of it stopped me completely. She was thin, pale, with light hair that was matted and unkempt, wearing a dark dress and leggings that were torn at both knees. She was not moving. She was just standing there, looking at me with an expression that I could not immediately read. I asked her if she was all right. I asked if I could help her with something. She looked at me for a moment in that same still way, and then she spoke. She asked if Alan was here. I told her no, and asked who Alan was. She turned around and went back down the stairs quickly, too quickly for how narrow they were and how dark it was. And by the time I got to the top of the staircase and looked down, she was already gone. I could not hear her footsteps on the gravel below. I shone my flashlight down the stairs and at the ground around the base of the tower, and there was nothing there. I went back inside and sat down at the radio and tried Tower B one more time. Static. I looked out at the place on the horizon where the light from Jim's tower should have been, and I saw nothing there, just the same flat darkness of the ridgeline and the cold, clear sky above it. I wrote the woman in my log and noted the time and sat back down with my coffee, which had gone cold while I was outside, and I held the cup in both hands and looked at the window and thought about the name she had said, Alan. I had not heard that name before in connection with this place. I turned it over in my mind for a while without it connecting to anything. Then I set it aside and went back to watching the tree line, and the night kept going the way nights do, one quiet hour at a time. The rest of that night after the woman left moved slowly. Not in a bad way, exactly. Just in the way that nights move when something has happened that your mind keeps returning to, even while you are trying to focus on something else. I did my checks. I swept the spotlights across the tree line in the intervals I had established over the past month. I listened to the radio static on Jim's channel for a while before switching it off. I drank the rest of my cold coffee and made a fresh pot and sat at the table and looked out at the dark without really seeing it. The woman had not seemed like someone in distress in the way that lost campers usually seemed. People who wandered too far after dark tended to have a particular quality to them, a frayed alertness, the specific kind of relief that comes from seeing another person in a dark place. She had not had any of that. She had been still in a way that did not fit the situation. Too composed for someone who had climbed a watchtower staircase alone in the middle of the night in the dark, in that condition, looking for someone she had not found. I wrote all of it in the log and left it there and kept working. It was a little after 4 a.m. when I heard a man's voice from somewhere below the tower. Not on the radio, from outside, from below, faint enough that I thought at first I was mishearing something, the wind doing something with a sound from further off and carrying it in a way that made it seem closer than it was. I went to the window and listened. It came again. A man calling out, not in a panicked way, but in the way someone calls out when they are tired and have been at it for a while, just his voice carrying through the cold air, asking if anyone was there. I went down. He was standing about 20 feet from the base of the stairs, holding a flashlight with a beam that had gone weak, the kind of pale yellow light a flashlight gives when the batteries are most of the way dead. He introduced himself as Alan. He said he had been out here for a few hours looking for his wife, that they had been camping, and she had wandered off sometime around midnight, and he had been searching since then. I asked him if his wife had light hair and was wearing a dark dress. The change in his expression was immediate. He said yes, that was her. Had I seen her? I told him that I thought I had, earlier in the night, that she had come up to the tower looking for him. I told him she had left quickly, and I had not been able to follow her, but that she had seemed all right, not injured as far as I could tell. He put his hand over his mouth for a moment and looked out at the trees, and then looked back at me. He asked if he could come up, if we could use the spotlights to try to locate her. He said his flashlight was almost done, and he did not know this part of the forest well enough to keep searching on his own in the dark. It was a reasonable request. It was the kind of thing I had done before in my ranger years, helping someone use a higher vantage point and better equipment to locate a missing person in a large, dark space. I told him to follow me up. We went up the stairs together, and I got the spotlights going, and we spent a few minutes sweeping them across the sections of the forest that were visible from the balcony. He stood beside me and watched and occasionally pointed to an area and asked if I could get more light on it, and I would adjust the beam and hold it there while we both looked. We did not find anything. I told him he was welcome to step inside out of the cold while I kept looking. He nodded, and I held the door for him, and he went in, and I turned back to the balcony and kept working the spotlights. I spent another few minutes out there, covering what I could see from the north and east sides of the balcony, and then I went back around to the door and opened it and stepped inside to tell him I was going to do another pass in a little while once I had checked the radio. The door swung shut behind me on its own. The latch caught. I turned around. She was standing in the middle of the room. She had come in through the door I had just come through, which was not possible unless she had been on the stairs behind me the whole time without making a sound on the metal steps. And I had heard nothing. She was standing in the low light of the cab with her hands at her sides, and she was smiling, and the smile was slightly too wide for the situation, slightly too settled, the smile of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has just seen it happen. She said I was a kind person. She said it in the way someone says something they do not mean as a compliment. Then she said I was stupid for letting a stranger inside my only safe space. I started to back up toward the door, and my shoulder hit something solid behind me. I turned around. Alan was standing directly behind me. He had been standing there the whole time, I close enough that I should have felt his presence, and I had not. The hood of his jacket was up now, in a way it had not been outside, and in the low light of the cab, it took my eyes a moment to process what I was looking at. Then it resolved, and I understood, and the understanding came with a particular cold quality that was different from anything I had felt before. There was nothing there. Where his face should have been, there was just skin, the same smooth, unbroken surface I had seen through the binoculars on my first night. And he made that sound, the same muffled, forced sound from before, louder now with only the walls of the cab between it and me. He came at me. I did not think in any organized way about what to do. I just moved. I jumped forward, toward him, and got both hands low and drove into his legs at the knee level, and he went down hard, one shoulder into the corner of the table on the way, and I stepped over him and put my back against the wall next to the door. His wife had moved around toward me from the other side of the room, and I turned into her and got my elbow into the side of her head, and she went sideways into the desk and went down against it and stayed there for a moment. Alan was already getting back up. He was faster than I expected. He got to his feet and came at me with one arm out, and I grabbed the arm and turned with it and put him into the wall and then let go and reached back for the door handle. I got it open about 6 inches before his weight came against it from behind and shut it again. And I went down and tried to get under his legs, and he grabbed the back of my jacket, and we hit the door together hard enough to shake it in the frame. I got my footing and drove back against him, and that created enough separation that I could turn. He swung. I got my forearm up, and it deflected most of it, and I hit him in the side, somewhere around the ribs, and he folded slightly. His wife was on her feet again and coming from behind him, and I stepped to the side, and she was moving too fast and went into Alan, and they both went into the corner near the cot. That was the space I needed. I hit the door handle and got it open and went through it and pulled it shut behind me. I had the key on a clip on my belt, and I got it unclipped and into the lock and turned it in one motion, and then I was running. Down the stairs, not looking back, taking the steps as fast as I could without losing my footing, and I hit the gravel at the bottom and kept going. After I had put enough distance between me and the tower that my legs started to slow on their own, I stopped and bent over with my hands on my knees and stayed that way for a moment. The air was very cold and very still. I straightened up and turned around. They were on the balcony, both of them standing side by side at the railing, looking in my direction. At that distance in the dark, I could not make out details, but I could see them standing there, and as I watched, they raised their hands and waved. The gesture was slow and ordinary, the kind of wave you give someone you are seeing off on a trip, unhurried and familiar. And Alan's face was back. I could see it from where I stood, the normal arrangement of features, and 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth, everything where it was supposed to be. He was just a man standing on a balcony waving. I stood there looking at that for a moment longer than I should have, and then I turned and walked toward the main road. What I kept coming back to as I walked was the door. I had locked it from the outside. I had the key on my belt, and I could feel the weight of it against my hip as I walked, and I knew I had turned it because I had heard the tumblers move in the lock. A door like that, a door that old and that solid, did not come open without a key or a significant amount of force, and I would have heard the force. But they had been standing on the balcony. I went over it again and again during the walk to the ranger station as the sky began to lighten at the edges and the birds started up in the canopy above the road. I went over the weight of the key on my belt and the sound of the lock and the door in its frame, and I could not make it work. I could not put together a version of events in which everything I was certain of was also true. I stopped going over it somewhere around the halfway point when the eastern sky was pale enough that I could see the road clearly without the flashlight, and I just walked and listen to the birds and let the morning come in around me without trying to make sense of anything. The ranger station was lit up when I got there. The morning staff had just come on, and there was coffee made, and I sat down in a chair in the front room and drank a cup of it without saying anything for a few minutes. Then I got up and went to my boss Dave's office and knocked on the door and went in and sat down across from him and told him everything. He listened without interrupting. He was good at that, Dave. He had been running this station for a long time, and he had the quality that comes from years of hearing reports from people who had been alone in the woods at night, a patient and non-reactive way of taking in information that I had always appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he picked up his phone and called the local police department. The officers came, and I went through it all again in the same order. The woman on the stairs, the man below the tower, the inside of the cab, the door, the key, all of it. They asked clear and practical questions, and I answered them as clearly as I could, and they wrote things down and said they would go out and take a look. After they left, I stood up and told Dave I needed a few days before I came back in. He asked me not to quit, and I told him I was not quitting, just that I needed a few days. Before I got to the door, I stopped and turned back. I told Dave to make sure he passed everything along to Jim when he came in. I said Jim had been out of contact the night before, and that his tower had been dark, and that someone should check on him. Dave looked at me from behind his desk with an expression that I did not immediately understand. He asked me who Jim was. I told him. The watchman in Tower B, on the one I had been in contact with every night for the past month, the one who had been walking me through the specifics of the forest and the fire patterns and the weather systems. Dave set down his pen. He said there was no watchman named Jim. He said there had never been a watchman named Jim, not in the time he had been running this station. Then he said that Tower B had not been in use for 2 years. He said the equipment up there was old and had not been maintained, and that there was no active radio set up in that tower and had not been for a long time. I did not say anything to that. Dave asked me something else, but I was not tracking it. I was thinking about the voice on the radio, the specific quality of it, calm and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who knew a place well and had been there a long time. I was thinking about the light I had seen on the horizon on clear nights, the faint, pale smudge of it, there and steady, night after night. I thanked Dave and walked out to my truck and sat in it for a while without starting the engine. The morning was fully light by then. The forest on both sides of the access road was bright and ordinary in the way that forests are in the morning, everything specific and green and present, and there was nothing about it that suggested anything other than what it appeared to be. I started the truck and drove home. Dave gave me 4 days before I was expected back. I spent the first 2 of them at home, mostly sleeping, getting up in the afternoons and eating something and sitting in the front room with the television on without watching it. The 3rd day, I drove into town and did some errands and had a meal at a diner and tried to feel like a normal person doing normal things. It helped, in the way that ordinary routines help when something has knocked you off your footing. The world looked the same as it always had. The diner smelled like coffee and fryer grease, and the waitress called me Han and refilled my cup without being asked. And I sat there for a long time after I finished eating, just being in a room full of people and noise. The fourth day, I went for a drive out toward the park and sat in my truck at the trailhead for a while, looking at the tree line, not the tower. I could not see the tower from where I parked, just the trees, ordinary and still in the afternoon light. I drove home and went to bed early and slept without any trouble. On Monday, I went back to work. David put me back on ranger shifts while the overnight situation got sorted out. He did not elaborate on what sorted out meant, and I did not ask. I did my ranger work, which was familiar and physical and grounding in the way that work with clear and immediate tasks tends to be. I walked trails and checked on camping areas and cleared some deadfall from a fire road in the southern section of the park and was tired in a good way at the end of each day. Nobody came back to me about Alan or his wife. I asked Dave once, about 2 weeks in, whether the police had turned anything up from their visit to the tower. He said they had found signs that the door had been locked from the outside, consistent with what I had told them, and that they had found no evidence of forced re-entry. He said they had not located anyone matching the descriptions I gave. I nodded and thanked him and went back to what I was doing. The tower position stayed open. I saw it listed on the internal board twice over the following weeks, and both times it came down after a few days without anyone having taken it. I thought about it each time I saw it, but I did not put my name in. I was not ready for that, and I was honest with myself about it. It was near the end of the 2 months that things changed again. By then, I had been doing ranger work long enough that the tower felt like something from a while ago, not resolved exactly, but distant enough that I had stopped going over it every day. The fall had deepened and the days were shorter, and the forest had taken on the specific quality it has in late autumn when the leaves are down and you can see further into the trees than you can at any other time of year. I had always liked the forest in that state. There was a clarity to it. I was on a standard evening patrol, the last run of the day before I clocked out, checking the northern camping areas and the perimeter trail that connected them. It was getting toward dusk, the light going flat and gray in the way it does in the last half hour before dark. I was on my way back toward the parking area when I heard someone calling from somewhere off to my left, further into the trees. It was a man's voice, not panicked, but raised in the way you raise your voice when you are calling out to someone you cannot see and want to be heard. I stopped and listened, and it came again, the same general direction, maybe 100 yards into the trees. I went toward it. He was standing in a small clearing between 2 sections of older growth, a man in a heavy coat with the hood up. The clearing was shaded enough that the light was already almost gone in there, and with the hood up, I could not see much of his face from where I stopped. He was looking at the ground when I came into the clearing, and he looked up when he heard me. He said he was looking for his son. He said the boy had wandered away from their campsite sometime in the afternoon, and he had been searching for the past 2 hours. He was calm about it, calmer than most parents were in that situation, and something about that registered in a distant way without forming itself into a clear thought. I told him I would help him look. I got on my radio and called it into the station, let Dave know I had a missing child report and was searching the northern section, and Dave said he would send another ranger. The man and I started walking. He talked while we walked, not in a conversational way, not back and forth, just talking in a low, continuous way while I moved my flashlight through the trees and called out for the boy. He talked about the forest, about how he had been here before, about how people tended to move away from him when they saw him coming, how that had been true for a long time. I made the kind of responses you make when someone is talking and you are mostly focused on something else. Short affirmations, small noises of acknowledgement. I was focused on the trees and the ground and listening for any sound a child might make. We came up on an empty campsite, a fire ring with old ash in it, and a cleared flat area where a tent had been at some point, the ground still showing the impression of the stakes. I checked around the perimeter of it with my flashlight. I looked at the fire ring and the ash and the flattened grass, and nothing told me anything recent had happened here. I turned to tell him we should spread out and cover more ground, and he was not there. I stood still and listened, and the woods had gone very quiet in the way they sometimes do at that specific transition between dusk and full dark, a brief stillness before the night sounds start up. My flashlight beam sat on the trees in front of me without finding anything. Then behind me, a single branch snap. The particular sharp sound of something dry underfoot. I turned around. He had taken his hood down. I want to be precise about what I saw because I have gone over it enough times that I know the details clearly. It was the same thing I had seen before. On the first night in the tower, through the binoculars, and then later through the window. The same smooth, unbroken surface where a face should have been, pale in the beam of my flashlight, without feature, and the same sound rising out of it without any visible origin, muffled and forced and wrong. I ran. I did not make a decision to run. My body was already moving before I had processed the full image of what I was looking at. I went back through the trees the way we had come, keeping to the path as much as I could, using the flashlight to keep my footing on the uneven ground. Behind me, I could hear him moving, and I could hear that sound, and the sound was useful in the same way that any continuous sound is useful when you are trying to track distance in the dark. As long as I could hear it, and it was not getting louder, I was maintaining the gap. I made it back to the main trail and turned south toward the tower. Not because I particularly wanted to be in the tower, but because it was the closest structure with a lock on it, and I knew the path to it well enough to run it without the flashlight if I had to. I ran the full length of the connecting trail and hit the gravel at the base of the stairs and went up without stopping. I got inside and locked the door and stood with my back against the wall beside it and listened. The sound faded. It went on for a while, audible from outside the cab, moving around the base of the tower in a way that was not random, not the movement of something confused, but the movement of something that was working through a problem. Then it went quiet. I stayed where I was for a long time. The radio was on the table, and I reached over without moving away from the wall and keyed it, and gave Dave my position and told him I was in the tower and that I needed him to send someone out. Dave's voice came back asking what had happened, and I told him I would explain when someone got there, and to please just send a ranger out to the tower. He said 20 minutes. I stayed against the wall and looked at the windows and listened to the night. The spotlights were off and the cab was dark except for the glow from the radio, and I did not turn on any lights. I watched the windows in the darkness and waited. It was maybe 10 minutes after I called it in that I heard the clicking. It was coming from inside the cab, not from outside, not from the stairs or the balcony. From inside, from somewhere near the far corner of the room, close to the cot. A small, dry, rhythmic sound, like someone clicking their tongue against the roof of their mouth, slow and even. I turned on my flashlight. A boy was standing in the corner by the cot. He was young, maybe 8 or 9, and he was wearing clothes that were not right for the weather, a light jacket and shorts, and his feet were bare on the wooden floor. He was looking directly at me, and when the flashlight hit him, he opened his mouth and screamed. Not a child's frightened scream. Something else. A high, grating, sustained sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his size should have allowed, and it did not stop. I went for the door. I got the key into the lock and turned it and pulled the door open, and the cold air came in hard, and I stepped out onto the balcony, and the boy's sound was still going behind me, and then something hit me from the side. Not the boy, the man. He had been on the balcony, standing against the wall beside the door where the spotlights did not reach, and he came off the wall and into me, and I went sideways into the railing. The railing held. He grabbed the front of my jacket and pulled, and I went with the pull instead of against it, and got my shoulder into him and drove him back into the wall of the cab. He was strong in a way that was more about weight and leverage than anything else, and I was aware that we were on a narrow balcony at height and that the railing was old. I got my arm across his and broke his grip on my jacket and stepped back and put the railing between us. He came at me again, and I dropped and grabbed him low, and he went over me and into the railing, and it buckled but held, and I got up and went back through the door into the cab. The boy was still in the corner, still making that sound. I crossed the room without looking at him and went to the far window and looked down at the gravel below. The angle was bad, but I could see the edge of the stairs on the south side. I went back to the door, and the man was coming through it. He got his arm across the door frame, and I slammed the door on it twice before he pulled it back, and then I had the door shut and locked, and I was back in the room with the boy who would not stop screaming. I stood in the middle of the room with the locked door behind me and the boy in the corner. And I looked at the window and thought about the distance to the ground and the angle of the stairs. And then I moved to the window and opened it and went out through it onto the section of balcony on the south side. The man was coming around the balcony from the north. I went down the stairs, not at a run, because a run on those stairs in the dark was a way to break an ankle, but as fast as I could manage while keeping contact with the railing. I hit the gravel and went south toward the main road without looking back, and behind me, I could hear the muffled sound and the boy's sound layered together until the distance and the trees absorbed them. I walked for a long time in the dark. When the ranger station lights came into view through the trees, I slowed down and walked the last stretch at an ordinary pace because I needed the time to get my breathing back and my hands to stop shaking before I went inside. And I needed Dave to hear what I was telling him clearly, without having to sort it out from the way I was saying it. I got to the door and stood outside it for a moment in the cold air. Through the window, I could see Dave at his desk, and another ranger at the table, and the coffee machine on the counter, and the ordinary lit interior of a place where people worked and knew what things were. I stood outside it and breathed and let the cold settle into me until my hands were steady. And then I opened the door and went in. Dave did not try to talk me out of leaving this time. He listened the same way he always did, with that patient and non-reactive quality. And when I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the surface of his desk for a moment. The other ranger at the table had stopped what he was doing and was looking at me, and the room was very quiet except for the coffee machine cycling through on the counter. Dave said he was going to call the police again and that he wanted me to stay until they arrived. I told him I would stay. The officers came and I went through it in the same order I always did. The man in the clearing, the walk through the trees, the tower, the boy, the balcony, the stairs. The officers asked their questions and I answered them, and they wrote things down. One of them asked if I had been drinking, and I told him no, and he nodded and wrote something down. When they left, Dave poured me a cup of coffee and set it on the table in front of me without saying anything, and I sat there and drank it. He told me before I left that he was not going to list the tower position again. He said it in a careful way, not as an explanation of anything, just as information. I nodded and said that seemed reasonable and put on my jacket and walked out to my truck. The drive home took about 40 minutes on the main road that ran along the eastern edge of the park. I had driven it enough times that it required very little active attention, and I let my mind stay quiet and just drove. The road was empty at that hour, no other headlights in either direction, and the trees on both sides were close to the road in the way they get in this part of the forest, the canopy meeting overhead in places so that the headlights illuminated a kind of tunnel effect for long stretches. I got home and went inside and sat down on the couch and did not move for a while. I did not turn on any lights. I sat in the dark in my own house and listened to the ordinary sounds of it, the refrigerator running, a pipe settling somewhere, the wind outside. After a while, I went to bed and lay there until it got light, and then I got up and made breakfast and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at my yard. I took 2 days. On the 3rd day, I called Dave and told him I was not coming back. He said he understood and thanked me for the time I had put in, and asked if I wanted him to pass along my forwarding details to HR. I said that was fine. We said goodbye, and I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a while, not feeling much of anything in particular. I spent the next week getting things in order. There was not much to get in order. I had not accumulated a lot in the time I had been working at the park, but there were small administrative things, and I worked through them steadily, and it gave the days a shape. By the end of the week, I had decided to drive north, to a town about 4 hours away, where I had a friend I had not seen in a couple of years. I did not have a clear plan beyond getting there. I just needed to be somewhere that had no connection to the last 2 months. I packed a bag and loaded it in the truck and left early on a Thursday morning when the sky was just starting to go from black to the specific deep blue that comes before dawn, and the road out of town ran through the eastern edge of the park for the first several miles before it cleared the tree line and opened up into the farmland and smaller hills of the valley. I had driven it hundreds of times. I drove it without thinking about it and watched the trees thin out on either side as I cleared the park boundary, and the sky ahead of me began to lighten. The fog came in about an hour into the drive. It came in gradually at first, the way valley fog does in that part of the country in the late fall, starting as a low haze over the flat sections of road and thickening over the course of a few miles until the headlights were doing very little, and I had slowed down to a pace that felt reasonable for the visibility. There was no other traffic. The road ahead materialized out of the white and disappeared behind me into it, and the world reduced itself to a short corridor of asphalt and fog and the sound of the engine. I had been driving in it for about 15 minutes when I saw the truck pulled over on the shoulder ahead. It was a heavy pickup, older, with a single cab and a long bed, and it was sitting with the hazard lights going, the orange pulses appearing and disappearing in the fog in a slow rhythm. I slowed down and pulled up behind it and sat there for a moment. Then I got out. The man was standing at the front of the truck looking at the right front tire, which was flat, deflated completely down to the rim. He was older, somewhere in his 60s, wearing a heavy canvas jacket and a wool cap, and he looked up when he heard me come up behind him with the particular tired relief of someone who has been standing on the side of a foggy road alone for long enough to have started wondering if anyone was going to come by. He said his spare was in good shape, but that his back had been giving him trouble and he could not manage the jack on his own. I told him I would help. We got the equipment out of his bed, and I changed the tire while he held the flashlight, and we talked about nothing in particular, the way men talk when they are doing a task together that only one of them needs to concentrate on. He asked where I was headed, and I told him north. He said he was going about 60 miles up the road in the same direction and offered me a ride rather than having me follow him on the fog if I did not mind leaving my truck on the shoulder until the fog cleared. I thought about it for a moment. My truck was fine where it was. The fog showed no sign of clearing, and 60 miles of driving in it alone was not particularly appealing. I said sure, thanked him, grabbed my bag from my truck and locked it, and climbed into the passenger seat of his. We drove. The cab of his truck was warm and smelled like old upholstery and a faint trace of pipe tobacco, and the heater worked well, and for the first 20 minutes or so, I was close to falling asleep in the seat. The man drove steadily and carefully, and we talked occasionally, and not talking the rest of the time, and the fog moved around the truck and the headlights, and the road kept coming. It was somewhere around the 20-minute mark that I heard it. It was faint at first, so faint that I thought it was a sound from the engine or from the heater, something mechanical with a small, irregular rhythm to it. I kept my attention on the road and let it sit at the edge of my awareness and tried to identify it without making anything of it. It came and went, in and out of audibility, and then it steadied and I placed it. Clicking. The same dry, rhythmic clicking I had heard in the tower cab, the same slow and even tempo, coming from directly behind me. I did not turn around immediately. I sat very still in the seat and kept my eyes on the road ahead and took a breath and told myself to be precise about what I was hearing before I reacted to it. I tilted my head slightly and listened, and the sound was there, steady, coming from the back seat of the cab. I turned around. The boy was sitting in the middle of the back seat. He was wearing the same light jacket and shorts from the tower, his feet bare, sitting with his hands on his knees and his back straight, looking directly at me with the same expression he had been wearing in the corner of the cab. The clicking was coming from him. He was making it with his mouth, the same slow, deliberate tempo. And when I turned and looked at him, he stopped. He looked at me for a moment without moving. Then he opened his mouth, and I had just enough time to turn back around and put both hands on the dashboard before the sound came out of him. That same high, grating, sustained scream filling the cab of the truck completely, and the man beside me turned to look at me, and I understood before I had fully turned my head what I was going to see. The smooth surface, the blank, featureless skin, and the sound beginning to come from him now as well, layered under the boys, the familiar, muffled, forced quality of it, and he took one hand off the wheel. I grabbed the wheel with my left hand and got my right elbow across into him hard enough that he came off me, and then I reached down and grabbed the door handle on my side and tried to get the door open at 60 miles an hour on a foggy road, which was not a rational thing to do, but the door was locked, and the lock was one of those manual ones set into the interior panel, and I got it up and tried the handle again, and it opened 6 inches before the wind caught it and pushed it back. He grabbed my arm. I let the door go and took his hand off my arm and got my foot across and hit the brake pedal, and we slowed fast enough that he went forward into the steering wheel and his grip came loose, and I got the door open in the reduced speed and put my shoulder into him one more time to pin him against his door, and held the wheel straight with one hand until we were down to a pace I could survive, and then I got out. The asphalt came up hard, and I rolled and came up running without entirely deciding to, the truck still moving slowly ahead of me for another 20 feet before it drifted off the road and went nose first into the drainage ditch along the shoulder and stopped there with the engine still running and the headlights pointing into the fog at a downward angle. I stood on the road and looked at the truck and caught my breath. The boy's sound had stopped. The only sounds were the truck engine idling in the ditch and my own breathing and the faint movement of fog-dampened air across the road. Nothing moved inside the truck that I could see from where I was standing. The hazard lights were still going from before, the orange pulse steady in the white air. I picked up my bag from the road where it had landed when I got out. I had not remembered grabbing it when I jumped. I stood there for a moment longer, and then I turned and started walking up the road in the direction we had been going. I walked for a long time in the fog. The road was completely empty of traffic, and the fog muffled everything and reduced the world to the few feet of road immediately ahead of me and the sound of my own footsteps. I walked at a steady pace and kept my breathing even and did not let myself think too far ahead of the next visible section of road. After a while, I became aware that I was not hearing anything behind me, and I kept not hearing anything for long enough that my shoulders came down from where they had been and my pace steadied out into something more sustainable. The fog began to thin maybe an hour into the walk, not clearing all at once, just becoming less dense in a gradual way, the visibility extending from a few feet to 20 feet to 50, and then the shapes of the hills on either side of the road beginning to emerge from the white, and then the sky above turning out to be lighter than I had realized, the sun somewhere above the fog already, the morning further along than the dark of the fog had made it feel. A truck came up behind me and slowed as it got close. A man and a woman in the cab, the man driving, both of them looking out at me with the expression people have when they come across someone walking alone on a rural road early in the morning in the fog. The woman rolled down her window and asked if I needed a ride and where I was going, and I told her north, and she said they were going that direction and to hop in. I put my bag in the bed and climbed in after it and sat with my back against the cab and my legs stretched out and watched the road go by behind us as they drove. The fog kept thinning, and the hills came up on either side of the road, and the sky above them was pale and clear, the kind of sky that comes after a heavy fog burns off, washed and specific, with a quality of light that made everything look very immediate and very plain. At some point, I turned and looked back down the road behind us. The fog was still thick back there, in the lower sections where the road ran through the valley floor, and the truck's taillights had pulled us up out of it and into the clearer air above. I looked back at the wall of white below, and I thought I saw something at the edge of it, a shape at the boundary where the fog met the clearer air, standing at the side of the road and watching the truck move away. Then I heard it, faint enough that I was not entirely certain I was hearing it, carried up from whatever distance separated us now, distorted by the air and the speed of the truck and the sound of the engine and the wind across the bed. That muffled, forced, wrong sound, getting quieter in the way sounds get quieter when you are moving away from their source, losing volume in small increments until it blended with the wind and then with the engine noise, and then with nothing, absorbed into the sound of the road and the hills and the morning coming in around me on all sides. I turned back around and faced forward and watched the road ahead. The hills got larger as we went north, and the valley widened, and the fog stayed behind us, and the sky above was empty and pale and very clear, and the truck kept moving. And after a while, there was nothing behind us that I could see at all.